You steal my spleen. Fine. I steal everything you own. By Geminycain. Chapter 2. Nothing's New. A sense of dread washed over Bruce as he opened his eyes. He dreaded where or when he would be when he opened them this time. The dread morphed into something similar to uneasy confusion as he found himself in a medical bay. When and where am I? He thought as he looked around for any immediate signs of danger. Heart monitor, IV bag, medical table, bed sheets, a black mess of hair, a cabinet. Wait. Bruce's eyes went back to the sleeping figure by his bedside and traced over the long dark hair, even though the person was wearing a dark uniform that he did not recognize. Bruce could not help but feel a sense of familiarity when he looked at the boy. Is this one of mine? With sore movements, Bruce managed to get himself to somewhat sit up. A grunt escaped him when he lifted his arm and moved the hair behind the boy's ear to reveal his face. Tim? Bruce blurted in disbelief. His son's eyes opened slowly before blue met icy blue, and Tim's eyes widened. Bruce. Tim looked exhausted, with dark bags under his eyes, and his cheekbones were hollowed to an unhealthy amount. But that was something Bruce had to worry about later, because somehow Tim was here, in front of him. In an unexpected movement, Tim wrapped his arms around Bruce and buried his cheek behind the older man's shoulder, as if Bruce would disappear again if he let go. Something about it felt almost desperate, and it caught Bruce off guard. But he quickly returned the hug and pulled Tim close to him, trying hard to remember the last time he had hugged his second youngest son like this, or hugged him in general for that matter. When his mind came back blank, he blamed it on the slight grogginess still looming in his head. How am I here? Bruce questioned after a minute. Tim let go of Bruce with reluctant movements. It took some time, but there were no more omega particles to pull you through time anymore. You're safe now. I found you, Bruce. The disbelief and desperation seeped out of Bruce as well as the alertness, and for the first time in, well, he was not sure how long, but the first time in what felt like too much time, Bruce could rest. He put a hand behind his son's head and pulled him close again. I knew you would. For almost a year, Tim had both wanted this moment desperately and feared it more than anything. It was this moment he had sacrificed so much of himself for, both metaphorically and literally. His spleen was currently on a shelf in his apartment. Having Bruce here, being able to hold him close, felt unreal. He could finally breathe. He had done it. He was done. And now he was not useful anymore. Tim was not Robin anymore. When Bruce recovered, W.E. would not need Tim anymore, and soon Bruce could return to the family, where Tim was no longer wanted. Instead of saying this to Bruce, Tim decided to ignore the pain from the newly gained wound on his chest and instead enjoy the moment while it lasted. He thinks he has earned that much at least. How long have I been gone? Bruce asked with a noticeably raspy voice. Tim let go and walked over to grab a plastic cup filled with ice chips and handed it in Bruce's direction. Bruce took one without hesitation, and Tim could see the man ease as the pain in his throat lessened. 9 months and 27 days, or, well, you technically came back 2 days ago, but I am counting from now since now is when you woke up, Tim rambled, which seemed to make Bruce smile before the reality of Tim's words hit him. Is the family all right? Did something happen to them? Bruce questioned with a hint of concern in his voice. The flinch that tried to show itself on Tim's features when Bruce mentioned the family did not even get a chance. You had your moment now. Don't be greedy, Tim. Family are all still alive, Tim said, taking his eyes away from Bruce and looking to the side. He stood up with a straightened back, and the way he presented himself became a far cry from the boy who had just hugged his ex-mentor with tears in his eyes. I'll go out and tell the JL to give the bats the go-ahead to come and visit you, Tim assured before he turned towards the door. Wait, Bruce blurted to Tim's surprise. It was almost a surprise to the man himself. Apparently, as he opened his mouth to say something, but then decided against it. Tim's eyes turned from Bruce to the side, and then he let out a barely audible sigh. I am happy that you're back, Bruce. You do not know what it means. Tim sounded uncharacteristically unsure of his own words. It gave Bruce a slight crease in his brow, and the man opened his mouth to say something again, but Tim closed the door behind him before he could hear what the words were. The hallway he walked into stood empty, so Tim took the opportunity to lean back against the closed metal door and breathe out a few heavy breaths as he tried to restrain the tears that desperately wanted to escape from his eyes. Pathetic. A voice that sounded like Tim but had the same tone as his mother echoed through his head. Dick tapped the nail of his pointer finger nervously against his thumb. If Dick was honest with himself, he had thought what Tim had told Alfred in the cave was the result of a mental breakdown. But could you blame him? Tim had been completely out of reach for the better part of a year, only to return shortly and get kicked out a window by Rachel fucking Ghoul of all people. And then he just disappear in the wind again, as if it had never happened. And all of a sudden, Dick had gotten a message from a shaken Alfred, who told them about how Tim had broken into the Batcave, was held at gunpoint by Alfred's double-barrel shotgun, rambled to the butler about Bruce being back yet again, and then flew off in the freaking Batplane. But then Big Blue had come to the Batcave and told them that Bruce had woken up, and Dick realized it was true. His dad was back. For so long, Dick had refused to let himself believe it, and the thought still felt unreal. When the door opened and Bruce was revealed sitting there in a hospital bed, it did not feel real. When Alfred hugged Bruce closer, Dick wondered why he could hug an illusion. When Bruce said he had missed them, he wondered if he was the only one who heard the man say it. But then Bruce said Dick's name, motioned for his oldest son to come over to hug him, and Dick could feel Bruce's arms around him. His father's arms around him. His father's real arms around him. Dick's emotion came flooding like a broken dam. This was Bruce. This was his father. And he was not dead. It's good to have you back, old man. Dick laughed through his tears. It's good to be back, Bruce answered with one of his rare soft smiles. I agree with Grayson. It is good to have you back, father, Damien said with a bow that made Bruce raise one of his eyebrows with a slurred, come here. Bruce pulled his youngest son in for a real hug, which caught the boy by surprise, but he did not fight back against the affection. Instead, he seemed to embrace it. Dick watched the whole thing with a warm feeling in his chest. Damien had grown a lot since Bruce had disappeared, and he felt so proud when the kid did not even try to stab Bruce for hugging him. The warm feeling in his chest barely even faded when the two pulled away from each other. Dick picked up on Bruce looking around the room with a questioning look. Babs and Steph are currently dealing with some birds of prey business, but they will be back soon. Cass is in Hong Kong, but she is going to be on her way as soon as she can without causing problems for her current mission. We texted Jason, but he hasn't responded. Dick explained, which seemed to put Bruce at somewhat ease. Good. I did not get to ask Tim for a lot of details about how everyone was doing before he left. Bruce sighed. Dick froze. Tim is here, or at least he was here not so long ago. He was the one that brought you back? Dick said in what was supposed to have been a statement, but ended up sounding more like a question. Of course, Tim had been the one to bring Bruce back. He was the only one who had looked after all. Yes? Did you not know that? Bruce questioned, having picked up on not just Dick's reaction to Tim being mentioned, but Damien and Alfred's as well. The way Damien had huffed in distaste and the way Alfred had looked away to the side. Well, you know how Tim is with secrets, Dick answered. For some reason, it felt like he was defending himself. But that was ridiculous, because nothing was wrong. Finally, nothing was wrong. This whole thing was over. Bruce was back. Everything could go back to normal again. Dick would go back to being Nightwing. He could spend more time in Bloodhaven. And Tim could finally stop searching for Bruce and return home to the family again. Where is he, Dick? Bruce asked in a tone reminding Dick more of Batman than Bruce. Everything was fine, yet he did not know the answer to Bruce's question. I don't... Where is who? A voice asked from the doorway. Not a single part of Tim wanted to be in the watchtower, and even less of him wanted to be standing here in this doorway. His breath did not quicken, neither did his heart, yet Tim felt on the verge of having a panic attack. Put yourself together, for Christ's sake, Timothy. The Drake finishes what they have started. The words Janet used to say ever since Tim's first gala when he was 5 and struggled not to fall asleep late in the night rung through his head. Finish what you started. Then you can leave. Tim! Dick smiled widely as if nothing was wrong, because of fucking course he did. When Dick came over to hug him, Tim took a step back and gave him a cold glare. A glance at Bruce's furrowed brow made Tim realize his mistake, and he quickly fixed it by smiling a more genuine smile than Dick could ever manage, even on a good day. Hey, sorry for being late for the family reunion. Got lost in these ridiculously long hallways, Tim said with a laugh that made Dick laugh in return and caused Bruce's brows to ease. Of course, a task as simple as finding your way is too hard for you to comprehend, Drake. Damien scoffed with venom, as if Tim daring to enter the room had been a great offense against the demon child's being. Damien, be nice to your brother, Dick said in a scolding tone that was not even stern enough to get through to a kindergartner. The word brother made Tim suppress a shiver. When Damien first arrived, Tim had been so excited for the chance to have a younger brother he could care for and teach tricks to, just like Dick had done with him. After an endless amount of Damien's cruel insults and his murder attempts, Tim had given up on the hope of Damien wanting to be his brother a long time ago. He's just a kid, Dick had scolded him when Tim had almost died bleeding out on the floor from Damien pushing him off the dinosaur in the Batcave. So was I, Tim thought bitterly. Back then, he had felt so guilty for telling them what happened that he stopped telling them whenever Damien tried to kill him altogether. After all, it was Tim who had done something wrong when Damien hurt him. Another tick sound came from Damien, which Tim decided to ignore. Anyway, you don't suffer from any major injuries, Bruce. You are most likely going to need a lot of time to regain your strength, but I managed to threaten, the other members of the JL to let you come home to the manor to recover instead of having you stay here in the watchtower, Tim explained. Bruce seemed relieved at the idea of leaving the bed he was currently in and finally getting to go home to the manor. A little time later, Dick came running down the hall with a wheelchair, gliding on it like it was a shopping cart. They all managed to get Bruce to sit down in the chair with combined effort. On their way out, Bruce was wished a speedy recovery from multiple JL members with Superman and Wonder Woman being the only ones to hug a grumpy Bruce on his way out. When they arrived at the Zeta Tubes, Bruce less than discreetly gestured for Tim to go in before him, as if he was scared Tim would not follow them to the other end if he was the last one to enter. So Tim entered right after Damien, and he took a place beside the boy as the scenery of the cave appeared. I do not understand why you stay around the family like a disease-bearing parasite. You should think someone raised in your status would have more dignity, Damien said coolly, without as much as glancing in Tim's direction as they stood there waiting for the others to come through. The memory of Damien's grandfather head down under the acidic green water while the poison made it impossible for him to scream out in pain went through Tim's brain, and the ghostly feeling of the burning feeling on his hands returned to him. I'm done with your family, Damien, Tim said so coldly. It made Damien's remarks seem like a snowflake getting lost in an avalanche. The boy's eyes widened, and he glanced at Tim for just a second before the Zetitude activated again, and Dick came through with a grin on his face. Good to be back, he exclaimed loudly. You have only been gone for an hour, Richard, Damien scoffed. Still doesn't mean I didn't miss this place, Dick said enthusiastically. Damien rolled his eyes, and Tim did not react at all. Bruce came out a little after, with Alfred pushing him forwards. His breath seemed to be caught in his throat as he looked in the exterior of the cave. It is good to be home, he mumbled, sounding exhausted. It is good to have you home, Alfred said softly before wheeling Bruce straight to the elevator that they had installed after Babs was attacked to make it easier for her to get down into the cave. But for now, I think it's best if you get some rest, Alfred chimed. Bruce let out a displeased groan, but did not put up any more of a fight to stop his butler. As the elevator pinged close, it left the three of them standing there alone. What a day, huh? Dick said, allowing himself to seem a bit more tired. Both Tim and Damien made a small hum of acknowledgement before churning each their way, Tim towards the manor and Damien towards the training mats. Tim was not surprised in the least when Dick followed after Damien. Tim gave the old painting of Bruce in the hallway a glance, and then he walked right past it. He walked past all the pictures of the family smiling happily as he wanted to make it to the door as soon as possible. Yet when he came to the stairs, he hesitated. Tim's hand traced over the familiar wooden texture of the handrail as he took a step up, then another one, and another one, until he was all the way up to the top and stopped at a door. A feeling Tim had a hard time putting a name on made a cloud of rainy mist fill his chest, all the way up to the ears. He opened the door to the room that he once called his and took in the exterior. It looks clean, and it is clean, Tim thought to himself, as there was not much else to say about the room. Where Polaroid photos used to hang in multitudes, the wall now stood bare. The bed looked cold and was so neatly made, it looked like no one had ever been there. The mist churned into a more familiar and hollow feeling as Tim wondered why he even bothered to come here again. Oh, there you are. Dick's cheery voice came from the doorway, and Tim repressed another shiver from showing itself. You turning in for the night, too? Would not blame you. It has been... Dick paused, trying to find the right word. A day. Dick laughed at the end, as he ended up reusing the same thing he had said earlier. I'm leaving. I have work to do. Dick stopped laughing. Tim moved to the door, but Dick used his arm to block the way. Whoa, you just got back. What could you possibly need to do? Dick laughed in an attempt to seem calm. Like a tiny drop making the water tip over, it was that moment Tim decided it was enough. It was not the cold anger or irritation he felt. It was just too much. All the tears he never cried, all the times he wanted to scream his lungs out for everything to just stop. Tim was tired of being hurt, tired of fighting other people's wars, and of being called a pretender and a failure when he got stabbed for his efforts, and here Dick was smiling at him. "It hurts to be here," Tim said with hollow words. Dick's smile faltered for a second before it returned. "What do you mean, baby? It hurts. It hurts when I look at you." Dick finally stopped pretending, and his smile disappeared completely this time. "Tim, I don't..." Dick tried, but as soon as he took his arm down to take his brother's hand, Tim was gone. Everything is going to be normal now, Dick's thought from earlier repeated in his head. Notes: a different version to the end of the conversation between Bruce and Tim that got rewritten. "I'll tell the others that you're awake. The families should come flocking in if they're not already trying to find a way to break into the watchtower." Tim spoke as he stood up from the bedside and started walking towards the door. "Tim, wait," Bruce blurted before he could leave. Tim stopped in the doorway. Why had he said that? Bruce was not sure if there was something he wanted to say to his son, but he had a bad feeling about letting him leave. He opened his mouth before closing it again. Tim's eyes turned from Bruce to the side, and he let out a barely audible sigh. "I'm happy you're back, Bruce. You do not know what it means." Tim sounded uncharacteristically unsure of his own words. It gave Bruce a slight crease in his eyebrow, but he still smiled softly as his son walked out the door. "I missed you too," he managed to say, not sure if Tim heard it on his way out.